Now that I've completed the brand new intermission content featuring Yuffie in Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade, I can't not talk about the ending. A lot of things happened in the final stretch of Intermission, from the final boss to the closing post-credit stinger involving a man who's supposed to be dead. There's a lot to discuss and think about, and even more things to ponder about the future of this saga. Sometime after finishing Remake last year, I made a video offering my predictions as to how much content Part 2 will contain, and I'll be repeating some of it here, but I'll also go into more detail about specific topics too. So this is a combined spoiler discussion and prediction video. I haven't been this interested in theorizing about a game's story and future since the heyday of Metal Gear Solid. This is a great feeling for me. It should go without saying, but if you somehow haven't noticed, this is a spoiler-heavy video. I will be directly discussing the very end of Intermission, which comes with the assumption that I'll touch on major aspects of the main game as well. So if you'd rather not hear all of that, then turn back now. Now that the warning's out of the way, let's just jump into it. I'll be discussing spoiler stuff in order of what appears in the game. Now before Intermission finishes, we catch a taste of Nero and Weiss, powerful members of Deepground, specifically of the Sviet's unit. The existence of Deepground was already hinted at in the main game, when Cloud, Tifa, and Barrett enter a hidden lab beneath the Sector 7 slums. But now, in Intermission, we get direct content featuring two of the most important members, and we get to fight both of them, one in Intermission and the other in the main game. The game doesn't give much to go on at the moment regarding their potential involvement in future entries of the Remake Saga, but I don't think they'll be around much. I assume, at the moment, that both Weiss and Nero will be confined to Deepground Labs, way beneath Shinra headquarters for the remainder of the story. But we haven't met Vincent yet, so there's no way to be completely sure. This side plot of the story might be revisited once we wake him up in Part 2. But I kinda hope it isn't, because part of me is still worried that the strangeness of Dirge of Cerberus will negatively affect Remake, despite the presence of Nero and Weiss actually working really well in Intermission. But the second part to this particular topic is whether or not Sonon will actually come back in some capacity, because I know a lot of people feel like he will. It's kind of easy to dismiss the idea, admittedly, because Sonon doesn't exist in the original game, but technically neither did Nero or Weiss. Plus, we've already witnessed firsthand supposedly dead characters coming back, at least momentarily, in the form of Biggs, Wedge, and especially Zack. Sonon's death does look fairly conclusive in the sense that he gets absolutely fucked up, but seeing him fade away into the darkness at Nero's grasp gives a vague impression that something will happen to him while his body is down there. Obviously, this is all just a guess. There's no mildly convincing evidence supporting this specifically, I'm just spitballing. But with the Deepground stuff out of the way, let's talk about the actual ending, or endings, plural, because there were a lot of cutscenes after the final fight against Nero. They just kept going. It was like I was watching the end of Return of the King. But I'm not complaining, quite the opposite actually. I wanted more, especially to alleviate the pain of waiting for Part 2. But we got what we got. Immediately after the last battle and Sonon's highly predicted death, Yuffie is seen running out of Shinra headquarters, pushing her way past reporters in tears. She makes it near the edge of the Sector 7 plate in time to see it fall away in fiery, hellish destruction. It's a very haunting view that does a more than adequate job of illustrating how incredibly destructive the dropping of the plate is, even more so than the sequence in the main game. In the original FF7, playing through it as a kid on a platform with limited technology, you might assume the event killed maybe a few hundred people, and that it wasn't that large of an area. But here, at the end of Intermission, it feels like complete and utter devastation that at least 10,000 people must have lost their lives in. This scene does a remarkable job of getting that across. The next scene shows Yuffie finally departing Midgar on a chocobo, presumably on the way to traveling through the Mithril mines, perhaps. She mentions joining up with other people, which has a pretty obvious meaning. After that, we get a glimpse of other folks on the road, our cast from the main game: Cloud, Tifa, Barrett, Aerith, and Red 13. Without missing a beat, they bring up the fact that they're traveling to the nearby village of Kalm. and after hitching a ride with the one and only Chocobo Bill, probably hinting at the return of the breeding minigame, they arrive at their destination. It begins to rain, and Aerith mentions her stomach feeling like it's in knots, and then they proceed to Kalm. This is a particularly interesting sequence of scenes because it heavily suggests that Part 2 will open with the group already inside the village, possibly as they're entering it. But one of the more popular guesses is that Part 2 will cold open directly into the flashback sequence of Cloud recalling his time spent with Sephiroth. And while I don't necessarily think it's a foregone conclusion just yet, I definitely agree that it would be an awesome way to start the game. Having a sweeping, wide shot of the truck on a highway, then cutting to the interior of it, revealing Cloud next to Sephiroth, not as enemies, but as allies. Then the first battle sequence against the dragon would basically play out as a tutorial, with the player only being able to control Cloud, and Sephiroth doing his thing as an AI partner, similar to Sonon. The dragon, being such a strong enemy, focuses only on Sephiroth until the tutorial portion is over, and it proceeds to one-shot Cloud before getting finished off itself by Sephiroth, who doesn't even break a sweat, illustrating the massive power difference between the two. Again, I'm not necessarily saying this is going to happen with 100% certainty, but it's definitely what I want. I think it'd be a fantastic way to open up Part 2, probably the most sensible way in general. The size of Kalm itself and the amount of things the player will have to do there is still completely up in the air, as we know nothing yet of how much of an expansion other locations in this world are going to receive. But I can definitely see it having some side quests to acclimate the player into the non-Midgar setting and to any new mechanics that may exist. This leads me to think about how the world map will be structured. My opinion on this hasn't really changed much from the video I did last year. I still believe that we won't get a true open world in the sense that we can go in any direction we want once we leave Kalm. Instead, I anticipate a segmented world with seamless transitions, where the entire map is made up of many large areas that connect major locations, like Kalm to Junon to Costa del Sol. Reason being, I think the dev team will want to illustrate how big the world truly is. In the first scene with the main game group, Barrett says it'll take a full day from sunrise to sunset to reach Kalm from Midgar on foot, and I assume the developers wish to convey this distance with a linear but large, open path between cities. You won't travel between major locations in a couple minutes on some scaled-down overworld, but probably in about an hour, with battles and such, following a long stretch of road or crossing wide-open plains. It's kind of like how Part 1 was structured, actually, and it's really obvious in Chapter 14 when Cloud, Tifa, and Barrett are allowed to travel between sectors. It is super linear, yes, but you have a lot of paths to explore. I think Part 2 will be the same, but with larger open areas and entire dungeons instead of hallways, corridors, and tunnels. And honestly, I think I would prefer this over a mostly empty overworld. It might be a bit more restrictive than a true open world, but it'll portray the scale of the adventure much better. Now, let's finally move on to the big bomb of a stinger that has a lot of people scratching their heads. The scene of Zack, now alive and well when he isn't supposed to be, visiting the Sector 5 church. He's standing just outside the door, practicing how he's going to greet Aerith with his dirty and rusty Buster Sword at his back, and once he finally works up the nerve, he barges in, expecting to see her, but is instead greeted by the sight of many Midgar citizens sprawled around in grief, exhaustion, and sadness. He looks on in disbelief before uttering Aerith's name when the game cuts to black. It's a small scene, but it has people talking the most out of all the endings. Following his alleged survival of his last stand at the end of the main game, it inspires only more questions instead of any answers. I've seen some people consider walking back on the assumption that this is an alternate timeline because they now believe that Zack is walking into the same church Aerith met Cloud in and simply missed her after she embarked on her journey with the rest of the group. But I don't agree with that, at least not yet. I still think that the alternate timeline theory is definitely on the table. Zack still has the Buster Sword in his possession, which is a unique weapon as he got it from Angeal, who got it from his father. And I don't think there's two Clouds wandering around anywhere either. If he did somehow transcend from his own timeline into the one we're playing in, then that could be messy from a storytelling standpoint because it's a huge continuity blunder waiting to happen. It would take a miracle to make it sensible. And what about all the citizens in the church? Are they seeking refuge from the plate falling? But that assumes the plate fell in this timeline to begin with. I've seen multiple people point out already that many of the nameless characters in the church are the same models used in previous pre-rendered cutscenes in the game, specifically the opening movie and the movie of the plate falling. This is a fair observation, but it could mean one of two things. Either this was a deliberate detail and we're catching on to something the CG team wanted us to notice, or this is coincidental and the CG team simply reused models to save time in making this short movie, and were not meant to look beyond face value. Unfortunately, we might not know which is the case until the next game comes out. It would be sad to spend so much energy theorizing about this scene based off a detail that ended up being a time-saving tactic on the CG team's part, but it's possible. If this is an alternate timeline, there's a ton of things that need to be cleared up, like what else has the absence of the Whispers changed? Will there be some sort of convergence of timelines later? And a new question that's popped up and being entertained by some people as a result of this scene is whether or not Aerith is even alive in this timeline. Her theme music plays during this scene, which could be a hint in itself. And these citizens might be mourning her. After all, she was a friendly neighborhood girl who was very active in her community. It stands to reason that she would know a lot of other slum inhabitants personally. But that also begs the question of, isn't Aerith supposed to die anyway to save the planet? Or does she have to die specifically in the Forgotten City? There's also a theory that Zack and the others in the church are the ones who are dead, and this is supported by the white background as Zack enters the building, which is a recurring motif in FF7 related content, and what he perceives as reality is actually the livestream, but he doesn't know. I'm not sure if I subscribe to this one because I don't necessarily see where this subplot would lead to if that was the case, because it doesn't seem like it'd be an idea that would affect the main storyline all that much, but I could be surprised. There's a ton of major implications depending on which route you go. If Zack exists in his own timeline, then that could mean Cloud might never meet up with Tifa in time to accompany Barrett and the others on the mission to Reactor 1, which means Barrett could die at the hands of Scorpion Sentinel, which means the Reactor 5 mission never happens, which means Cloud never meets Aerith in time to prevent her from being taken by Reno, and all of that could mean the Sector 7 plate never drops to begin with. It's probably still within the realm of possibility for things to readjust themselves somewhat from there, but major events might not happen as a result of Zack surviving. And then there's the question of Aerith being dead or not. If she is, then Sephiroth is practically unopposed in his mission to take over. However, isn't Aerith needed to retrieve the Black Materia from the Temple of the Ancients? Or would Sephiroth manage to get it himself eventually? If the purpose of that stinger was to make everyone more confused, then it sure succeeded, because there's only more theories going around now, and there's a good chance that either this scene or the scene in the main game could be a red herring of some sort. But I definitely do think Zack is in a separate timeline, and I think the purpose of it is to show that getting rid of the Whispers was ultimately a bad idea, or at least a futile one, because I have a strong feeling that regardless of anything anyone does, major sacrifices will still need to be made in order to stop Sephiroth. There's unfortunately not much else to go on as far as my eyes can see in regards to the details of this specific event. The interior of the church is a tiny bit different from what we see in the base game. Namely, the wooden cross in the back is actually present this time, and the flowers do seem to be a bit wilted or stepped on, which I guess could be symbolism in itself about Aerith's condition. Aside from those things, everything seems identical. I don't know if there's anything else to extrapolate info from, so I guess the conversation revolving around Zack will have to be put aside for now as we endure the excruciating wait for Part 2. But if the alternate timeline theory is correct, I definitely expect some sort of convergence event to happen later in the story in some shape or form, where both timelines finally come together. For all I know, it could be the final fight against Sephiroth, where Cloud and Zack team up in the Singularity to finish off some powerful, time-traveling Sephiroth from a post-Advent Children future. It's anyone's guess at the moment. For the most part, other gameplay and structure predictions I have are largely unchanged from my original prediction video from last year. Over time, I think I've begun to lean towards the remake Saga ending up being 4 parts instead of 3. And if the individual entries are structured like I anticipate, then it's probably, honestly, for the better. I know that's an unpopular opinion to have, as a lot of people would like this story to be done in a timely manner without sacrificing the scope, and I get that. But I would like to see this world as expanded as possible and keeping up a consistent pace. I think 4 parts is better for accomplishing that, assuming they aren't like 60 hours long each or something. There's several different but reasonable ending points for each game that I go over in my old video. Among them, I have a pretty strong feeling that Part 2 will end at either Rocket Town with Mount Nibel being the final big dungeon, sort of like how Shinra HQ was in Part 1, or Wutai after acquiring the Tiny Bronco, because it will probably be a mandatory part of the story now due to Yuffie no longer being optional. The war with Wutai plays no small part in the background of Part 1 and Intermission, so I think its participation in the story will be much, much bigger. From there, if I were to pick an ending for Part 3, I would definitely choose the point immediately after Sephiroth awakens in the Northern Crater and uses the Black Materia to summon Meteor. Waking up in the custody of Shinra as Tifa and waiting for your execution along with Barret would be a high-intensity cliffhanger to leave off on. Again, this is just my guess. I know some people would hate the idea of 4 parts simply due to the waits between each and to finish the whole saga, but I think it'll be for the best, assuming each part has a similar pace and amount of content. There's also a conversation that could be had about when we think Part 2 will come out, but this is something that's much harder to gauge unless you're straight up a Square Enix employee. The most popular estimate is the second quarter of 2023, around 3 years after the release of Part 1, and I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I think there is hope for it to come out a little earlier, perhaps even late 2022, and I know that sounds unreasonably optimistic, but I have my reasons for entertaining the thought. First is the simple fact that the turnaround on almost any direct sequel is likely to be shorter than the turnaround on the first game, because time is saved thanks to assets, animations, and gameplay already being there. In Remake's case, much of the story is already there too. Second, Nomura already confirmed way back in November 2019 that development on Part 2 was already underway, which means it'll have had an almost 3-year development cycle by the time late 2022 comes around. I'm not saying it's a sure thing, it could very well come out in April 2023. I'm just trying to offer a more optimistic possibility. So, overall, Remake definitely continues to be an amazing, jaw-dropping experience with some potentially divisive narrative choices due to its new ambitions that weren't in the original game. I don't like Dirge of Cerberus, neither its story nor its gameplay. But I'm surprised at how much I did like the implementation of Deepground, Nero and Weiss in Intermission. That and the mere concept of Zack being alive in an alternate timeline are definitely creative choices that would aggravate or at least confuse some people and basically be considered sacrilege in the face of the original game. But I personally remain enthusiastic because the implementation of these characters and ideas has, so far, been extremely investing. I think a lot of people who are angry are mostly so at the potential awfulness of a fumbled ending these things could get later, and admittedly that is still possible. Ambition inherently comes with a chance of massive failure. But for me, I'm thinking of how incredible it could be if it sticks the landing. If these far-out, outlandish ideas manage to be sensible and beneficial to the overarching plot in the long run, it could make this entire saga even more special than it already is. I think that's everything worth touching on at the moment. Intermission gave us a brief but immensely satisfying reprieve from the wait for Part 2, but sadly it's time to continue it. This concludes my spoiler discussion for the new contents of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.